The first emergency alert came at 3:17 a.m. The loud, jarring tone snapped me out of my half-asleep haze, my phone vibrating violently on my nightstand. I fumbled for it, my pulse already spiking before I even read the words. Emergency alert. Nuclear incident detected. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a test. My stomach dropped. I'd seen false alarms before, accidental missile warnings, malfunctioning alert systems, but something about this felt off. For one, there was no location attached. Usually, these things pinpoint an epicenter or at least mention a city. But this? Just a blanket warning with no specifics. Then, a second alert followed barely a minute later. All units, report to staging area immediately. Mandatory deployment. I'm a hazmat technician, trained for biological and radiological containment. My team is usually the first in when things go south, chemical spills, industrial leaks, that kind of thing. But this wasn't a normal call. I threw on my uniform, grabbed my gear, and drove towards staging area Bravo, just outside the city. The streets were already in chaos. Traffic jams at intersections, people abandoning their cars and running on foot. The air buzzed with uncertainty. There had been no sirens, no explosion, no sign of an actual attack. Just the alert. By the time I reached the staging area, the National Guard had already set up roadblocks. The base was flooded with emergency personnel, firefighters, police, military, and dozens of hazmat teams like mine. The higher-ups stood in clusters, speaking in hushed, panicked tones. I caught sight of my supervisor, Captain Reynolds, pacing near the debriefing tent. His face was pale, his usual commanding presence replaced with something I hadn't seen before: uncertainty. What the hell is going on? I asked. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. We don't know yet. Site 13 suffered some kind of containment breach. No explosion, no fire. Just something bad. Site 13. I'd heard the name before, always wrapped in government secrecy. Officially, it was a nuclear research facility. Unofficially, no one really knew what they did there. Some said weapons testing. Others whispered about biological experiments, things that weren't meant to exist. Radiation levels? I asked. Reynolds hesitated. Low. Inconsistent. But people inside the zone are acting strange. Strange how? He didn't elaborate, just motioned for me to follow. Arrival at Ground Zero. We deployed in 2 armored transport vehicles, rolling through eerily empty streets. The city, which should have been gridlocked, was strangely silent. No sirens, no people, just abandoned cars, their doors swinging open like the occupants had simply vanished. My Geiger counter sat on my lap, its needle barely twitching. If this was a nuclear event, or was the radiation? We reached the perimeter of Site 13, where military barricades had been hastily constructed. The soldiers posted there looked wrong, not sick but distant, like they weren't fully present. Their eyes tracked us as we passed, but none of them spoke. Inside the perimeter, the world felt different. The air was thick, not with smoke or fallout, but with an unsettling weight, like something unseen was pressing down on my chest. Then I saw the first body, a man in a lab coat, lying in the middle of the street. His face was frozen in a grin, his eyes wide and bloodshot. There were no burns, no wounds, nothing to indicate how he had died. But his fingernails were missing, torn away as if he had tried to claw something out of himself before he died. A shiver ran through me. Jesus, someone muttered behind me. That's when the birds fell. A flock of crows, flying overhead, suddenly dropped from the sky. No gunfire, no explosion, just fell. Their bodies twitched, wings flapping uselessly against the pavement. I moved closer, nudging one with my boot. Its beak opened, but instead of a caw, I heard a garbled whisper. I stepped back, my heart hammering. Did you hear that? No one answered. The radio on my chest crackled to life. Alpha Team, report. Reynolds grabbed his mic. We're at the entrance of Site 13. No visible fire, no structural damage. But we've got something else. A pause. Then, something else. Reynolds glanced at me. Bodies. No burns. Just wrong. Another pause. Then a new voice cut in, who I didn't recognize. A woman, speaking calmly, but with something unsettling in her tone. Do not engage with the affected. If they're not responsive, leave them. Reynolds frowned. What does that mean? No response. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A man staggered out of a nearby alleyway, dressed in hospital scrubs. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the flickering streetlights. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. I raised my flashlight. Sir, can you hear me? He turned toward us, and I swear to God, his eyes moved in different directions, like they were trying to look at everything at once. His head tilted, his jaw working like he was chewing on something. Then he smiled. His teeth were gone. All of them. He took a step forward. Reynolds grabbed my shoulder. Leave him. What? The man's grin widened. His lips cracked, blood trickling down his chin. Leave him. I backed away. The man just stood there, swaying slightly, that eerie grin never fading. Then I heard it, a sound, not a voice, not a growl, but something between, like a radio signal warping in and out of frequency. C-H-H-H-K, K-K-S-H-H-H, K-R-R-H-H-H. It wasn't coming from my radio. It was coming from inside his throat. Then, all at once, every radio crackled to life. A voice distorted, layered with static. Do not let it inside your head. The man twitched violently, his limbs spasming as if something invisible was pulling his strings. His body contorted in ways that bones shouldn't allow. Then he lunged. I grabbed my rifle, but before I could react, gunfire erupted. The last thing I saw before we ran was the man laughing, his mouth stretching too wide, his body convulsing, before he collapsed, twitching on the pavement. And over the sound of gunfire and screaming, the radios kept repeating the same message. Do not let it inside your head. We dragged the bodies inside the checkpoint, but I wasn't sure why. They weren't people anymore. Their flesh was cold, yet they still twitched. The sound, that awful, warped signal, still hissed from their throats like a broken transmission, even after death. Do not let it inside your head. The message had stopped repeating over the radios, but it still echoed in my skull. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing. Locking down the perimeter. The checkpoint had been set up on a blocked-off highway leading towards Site 13. Sandbags, barbed wire, and hastily erected floodlights cast harsh white beams over the abandoned cityscape beyond. Inside, a dozen soldiers stood ready, some watching the perimeter, others watching us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching all of us. Captain Reynolds was on the radio with command, his voice sharp, controlled. Yes, sir. Symptoms include erratic behavior, auditory disturbances, and violent outbursts. Some victims appear unresponsive before onset. He paused, glancing at the two corpses we had dragged in. Negative on radiation burns. No physical signs of exposure. The voice on the other end crackled through the static. Confirmed. We have similar reports across multiple zones. Maintain quarantine protocols. Reynolds grimaced. Sir, permission pull back? We're losing people out here, and whatever this is, it's not just radiation. Another pause. Then, negative. Orders are to contain the situation. Hold position. Reynolds cursed under his breath and slammed the radio down. That's when the first evacuees arrived. They're not normal anymore. The first few survivors stumbled through the darkness like zombies, but they weren't mindless. They looked at us, their eyes too wide, their expressions shifting between pleading and mocking grins. One woman whispered constantly, her lips barely moving, saying things like, "It's listening. Don't breathe too loud. I see it in the light." A man stood completely still, staring at the checkpoint gate. He had clawed his own ears off, leaving bloody holes in the side of his head. When one of the soldiers stepped toward him, he smiled, a horrible, teeth-baring grin, then whispered, "Too late." Then all hell broke loose. The attack. One of the evacuees, a young guy in a torn hoodie, suddenly lunged at a soldier, biting into his throat with inhuman strength. Gunfire erupted instantly, but it was too late. The soldier collapsed, screaming, gurgling, his hands clawing at his own face as if something was inside his skin. More people rushed the checkpoint. They weren't monsters, not yet. They still looked human, but their bodies moved wrong. their limbs jerking violently like puppets on invisible strings. Some laughed, others shrieked, but the worst were the ones who didn't make a sound at all, just smiling as they tore into our defenses. We opened fire, but they didn't stop. Bullets ripped through flesh, but there was no blood. Not right away. They staggered, faltered, then kept crawling forward, their fingers digging into the dirt as they twitched toward us. And then came the fog. The fog rolls in. I don't know where it came from. 1 second, the air was clear. The next, a thick gray mist was rolling through the streets, swallowing the city behind it. The floodlights flickered. The moment the fog touched them, the evacuees stopped moving. At first, I thought they were dead, but then I saw their mouths moving, whispering something I couldn't hear. One soldier, Martinez, made the mistake of stepping forward. He only took 2 steps before he froze mid-stride, his entire body locking up. His rifle slipped from his hands, clattering against the pavement. His mouth opened wide, too wide, but no sound came out. Then his eyes moved, darting in different directions, as if something inside his skull was looking around through his sockets. And then he laughed. Not a normal laugh, a sound that warped in and out of frequency, shifting between a garbled radio transmission and something that wasn't human at all. The other soldiers panicked. Pull back. Pull back. Martinez's spine snapped backward, his head tilting at an impossible angle. And then he sprinted. Not at us. Into the fog. He vanished instantly, the mist swallowing him whole. None of us went after him. A signal we can't block out. We barely managed to seal the gates before the fog overtook the checkpoint. The emergency lights bathed us in a dim red glow, making everything feel more unreal. The surviving evacuees, the ones that hadn't turned yet, were huddled together, whispering. The radios crackled again. Do not let it inside your head. This time, the message sounded clearer, like it was closer. I turned the volume down, but the voice didn't stop. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from inside my own head. Nowhere feels safe. Captain Reynolds was barking orders, trying to get a secure line back to command. We need an immediate airstrike on this location. The fog is moving. Repeat, this is a containment breach. No response. Then the emergency alert system blared again. This is not a test. Avoid exposure to unknown atmospheric conditions. Seek immediate shelter. I looked around. We were in shelter, and it wasn't helping. The evacuees were getting worse. Their hands shook, their eyes twitched. One of them, a middle-aged man with a bloody bandage over his head, grabbed my arm suddenly. His grip was ice cold. It's not the radiation, he whispered. That's not what's killing us. I swallowed hard. Then what is? His eyes darted past me, looking at something I couldn't see. His lips trembled. It's listening. Before I could ask what he meant, one of the floodlights exploded, plunging part of the checkpoint into shadows. The fog crept closer, curling over the barricades like fingers reaching for us. Something moved inside it. Not a person, not a thing. Something without a shape. Something I could feel staring at me, even though it had no eyes. And then all at once, the radios turned back on, broadcasting a new message. A voice, deep and calm, speaking in an unfamiliar language. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the meaning. It was not a warning. It was a greeting. The fog pressed against the checkpoint like a living thing. It slithered over the barricades, curling through the razor wire, as if searching for a way in. I could hear it now, not just the whispers, but something beneath them. A low, inhuman hum, shifting in and out of frequency. The evacuees were losing control. Some of them rocked back and forth, their hands clamped over their ears. Others mumbled to themselves, repeating phrases and languages I didn't recognize. A woman in a blood-stained sweater suddenly shrieked and ran straight for the fog. She didn't get far. The moment she crossed the threshold, her body locked up. She stood perfectly still, head tilted toward the sky, her mouth working silently. And then she dissolved. Not like she burned, not like she faded away. She just stopped being there. 1 second, she was a solid, screaming woman. The next, she was gone, as if something had erased her from existence. My stomach twisted. We have to get out of here now, I said, gripping Captain Reynolds' arm. He shook his head, jaw clenched. "We hold the line until we get new orders." I stared at him, disbelieving. "You saw what just happened. There's no fighting this. We don't even know what this is." Reynolds didn't respond. He was staring past me, into the fog. His hand twitched at his side, like he was resisting the urge to move forward. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was about to step into it. I grabbed his shoulder. "Captain," he blinked rapidly and shook his head as if snapping out of something. His breathing was ragged. "I heard my daughter," he murmured. She's not even here, but I heard her calling my name." I didn't know what to say to that, because I had heard something too. It hadn't been a voice. It had been my own thoughts, but twisted like a memory I didn't have trying to push its way into my mind. A memory of standing in the fog before, of being here before, and worst of all, the absolute certainty that I hadn't survived last time. Thermal imaging shows something. The soldiers at the barricade were getting jittery. Every few minutes, one of them would freeze up, staring at the fog like it was whispering just to them. A tech guy, Watkins, I think, was fiddling with the thermal scope attached to a drone. He cursed under his breath, shaking the monitor as if that would change what he was seeing. Reynolds walked over. "What is it?" Watkins hesitated, then turned the screen toward us. At first, it just showed the fog, nothing but static and shifting gray patterns. But then, as I stared closer, I realized there were shapes inside it. Not people, not even remotely human. They weren't walking or moving like living things should. They were shifting, twisting in and out of focus, their bodies stretching and folding in on themselves as if they didn't have a fixed shape. The temperature readings were unstable. One moment, they were colder than the air itself. The next, they spiked hotter than fire. But the worst part, they were getting closer. The fog was bringing them in. A warning too late. The radio clicked on again. A new voice this time, hurried, desperate. "To any units still in the quarantine zone, get out. Get out now. Do not engage. Do not." Static. Then something else came through. A sound like breathing. Deep, slow, unnatural. The kind of breathing that made my skin crawl. Then a single word. "Listen." The fog pulsed, rippling outward as if responding to the voice. Watkins suddenly screamed, dropping the monitor as he clutched his head. Blood poured from his nose, his ears. I lunged forward, grabbing him before he collapsed. "Watkins, talk to me." His eyes rolled back, his mouth working soundlessly. Then he spoke. In my voice, "You've been here before." I let go of him immediately. He slumped forward, shaking violently, gasping for air. I stumbled backward, my pulse hammering in my skull. I just heard that? Had he really just... The radio crackled again. This time, it was my voice coming through. "You've been here before." A shudder ran down my spine. I slammed the radio off, but the message kept playing anyway. "You've been here before. You didn't make it last time. You won't make it this time." The fog pressed closer. A desperate escape. I turned to Reynolds. "We need to pull out. Now." Reynolds hesitated, looking back at the soldiers manning the checkpoint. They were barely holding it together, their hands white-knuckled around their rifles, eyes darting wildly. But the fog was still coming, and whatever was inside it, it was watching us. Something moved just beyond the barricade, closer than before. I barely caught a glimpse. A shape shifting between too many forms, too many limbs, like it was trying to figure out how to be human, but kept getting it wrong. One of the soldiers, Peterson, snapped. "I'm not dying here," he muttered. He threw down his rifle and ran toward the transport trucks. The second he turned his back to the fog, something lashed out. A tendril. Asterisk, asterisk, no. A shadow. No, something I can't even describe. Asterisk, asterisk shot forward and wrapped around his ankle. He screamed, twisting, clawing at the pavement. Then he was yanked backward, straight into the fog. Gone. Just like that. The fog speaks. The radios turned back on, whether we wanted them to or not. A chorus of distorted voices, overlapping, whispering things I couldn't understand. Then, one voice rose above the rest. Calm, deep, unshaken. "This is not your first time." The floodlights flickered violently, casting shifting shadows across the barricade. The fog was inside the perimeter now. Something stood among us, not hiding, not attacking, just waiting. And then, the last words came through the radio. A final message, delivered with absolute certainty. "You belong to it now. and the floodlights died completely. The floodlights went dark. For the first time since we arrived, the checkpoint was completely silent. No more screaming, no more gunfire, just the sound of our own breathing, ragged and shallow, as the fog pressed against us. I clenched my fists, trying to steady myself. Around me, the other soldiers were frozen, gripping their rifles with trembling hands. Something moved beyond the barricades. Not footsteps, not voices, just a shift in the air, like something too large to be real was gliding through the fog, unseen. Reynolds whispered into his radio, barely audible. "Command, do you read? This is Captain Reynolds at Checkpoint Bravo. We need immediate evac." "Repeat, immediate evac." The response came almost instantly. But it wasn't command. It was the same distorted voice that had whispered through the emergency broadcasts. "There is no evacuation." The fog swirled, pressing against the barricades like a living thing. Then a new sound reached us. At first, I thought it was wind, but it wasn't. It was laughter, not human laughter, not one voice, dozens, hundreds, all of them laughing at different pitches, some deep, some high, some broken and wheezing. I turned slowly, and I saw the evacuees standing among us. They never left. The people we had let inside the checkpoint, the survivors who had stumbled out of the city. They had changed. Their bodies were unnaturally still, their eyes too wide, their mouths stretched into identical smiles. A woman in a tattered dress stood by the barricade, staring into the fog. Her lips moved silently, as if repeating something over and over. A teenage boy held his arms outstretched, palms up, as if offering something invisible to the darkness. And then there was the man in the bloodstained hoodie. He was grinning, not like he was happy, not like he was scared, just grinning. His teeth were gone. His mouth was just a black void, stretching too wide for his face. I stepped back, and that's when they all turned their heads toward me. At the exact same time, like puppets on a single string. They know we see them. I raised my rifle. I don't think they're alive, Watkins stammered. No one moved. No one blinked. The evacuees just stood there, their bodies swaying gently, their smiles never fading. Then, the man with no teeth spoke. His voice came from my radio. "You were never meant to leave." A jolt of terror shot through me. Then, everything happened at once. The fog rushed forward, rolling over the barricades in a thick, suffocating wave. The soldiers opened fire, bullets tearing through the silent evacuees. But it did nothing. They just kept standing, grinning, staring. The laughter grew louder. It came from inside the fog now, surrounding us, overlapping, rising into an unbearable, chaotic sound. Watkins collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. I can't. His skin started to ripple, like something was moving beneath it. I grabbed him, shaking him. "Don't listen to it. Focus on me." His eyes snapped open, and they were completely black. And then he whispered, "It's learning. The truth about Site 13. A gunshot rang out. I turned just in time to see Reynolds lower his pistol, his face pale. Watkins lay still, blood pooling beneath him. Reynolds' hands were shaking. He wiped sweat from his brow, his breathing coming in short, ragged gasps. "The fog isn't radiation," he muttered. It's not fallout." I stared at him. "What are you talking about?" His gaze flickered toward the evacuees, still standing, still grinning, their blackened mouths stretching too wide. And then he said something that made my blood run cold. They knew this would happen. My pulse pounded in my ears. "Ooh." Reynolds swallowed hard. "The government." I shook my head. "That's not possible. This was a nuclear event. It was an accident." Reynolds let out a bitter laugh. "That's what they want you to think. The failed experiment." I barely heard him over the howling wind. The fog was inside the checkpoint now, curling around our boots, seeping through cracks in the barricade. Reynolds took a deep breath. Site 13 wasn't a research lab. His voice was hoarse, unsteady. It was a containment facility. A cold weight settled in my stomach. "They weren't studying radiation," he continued. "They were studying something else. Something they found in the fallout of another disaster. Something that wasn't supposed to exist." The realization hit me like a truck. They weren't trying to stop radiation from spreading. They were trying to stop something else from spreading through the radiation. And they had failed. "It's not just here." The radios clicked back on. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was a news broadcast. Evacuations ordered in all major cities. The emergency alert system has been activated nationwide. Citizens are urged to remain indoors. Reynolds and I locked eyes. My throat was dry. It's spreading. The fog rolled over the checkpoint, swallowing the evacuees. Their smiles vanished, their bodies dissolving into the mist like they had never been there at all. The ground trembled beneath us. A new sound echoed from the depths of the fog. Not laughter anymore. Something else. A voice, deep and distorted. It didn't sound angry. It sounded hungry. Reynolds grabbed my arm. We're leaving. Now, final broadcast. As we sprinted toward the transport trucks, the last emergency alert flashed across our screens. A single message. This is not a test. Do not perceive. Do not speak. Do not follow. I risked one last glance behind me. In the fog, something was watching us. And this time, it wasn't smiling anymore. We ran. The fog rolled over the checkpoint, swallowing the barricades behind us. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it watching us. Our boots pounded against the pavement as we sprinted toward the transport trucks parked at the edge of the staging area. The other soldiers, those who were still alive, were ahead of us, scrambling into the vehicles, slamming doors, shouting orders. Reynolds and I threw ourselves into the back of the lead truck just as the engine roared to life. The convoy lurched forward, tires screeching against the asphalt. We were leaving the checkpoint behind, but something inside me knew we weren't getting out of this. Something is coming with us. The transport jolted violently as we sped down the empty highway. Inside, everyone was silent. 10 of us, packed in like sardines, clutching our weapons, sweat dripping down our faces. No one spoke. No one dared turn on their radios. A single voice would be too much right now. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the truck. I shifted, gripping my rifle tighter, scanning the other soldiers. None of them looked at me. They were staring at the walls of the truck, their expressions blank, as if they were listening to something only they could hear. I swallowed hard. Reynolds, he didn't respond. My chest tightened. Reynolds, slowly, he turned his head toward me, and I saw it. A thin trickle of blood leaking from his nose. His pupils were too wide, his breathing slow and unnatural. Something was inside his head. I reached for him, shaking his shoulder. Hey, stay with me, okay? He blinked rapidly, as if snapping out of a trance. He wiped the blood from his nose, looking around like he had just woken up in the truck for the first time. Shit, he muttered. I exhaled shakily. What did you hear? Reynolds hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice, he whispered. It was saying my name. I didn't know what to say, because I had heard something too. Not a voice, not words, just laughter. The road isn't safe. The driver's voice crackled through the truck's intercom. We've got movement ahead. I tensed. What kind of movement? A pause. Then, I don't know. The convoy slowed. Reynolds and I exchanged a look before moving toward the back doors. Another soldier, a young guy named Hale, reached them first. He unlatched the handle and pulled the doors open just a crack, and immediately gasped. Reynolds yanked the doors fully open, and my stomach dropped. The road ahead was full of people, not evacuees, not soldiers, people who shouldn't be there. A man in a business suit, standing in the center of the highway, perfectly still. A little girl clutching a doll with no face, her wide eyes locked onto the convoy. A woman in a hospital gown, her head tilted at an impossible angle, staring up at the sky. They weren't moving. They weren't breathing. They were just waiting. I clenched my jaw. Run them over. The driver hesitated. Sir, I grabbed the intercom. I said run them over. The convoy lurched forward again. The people didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't scream. The first truck plowed through them, and the second it made contact, the fog exploded outward, swallowing the vehicles whole. Inside the fog, everything vanished. 1 second, we were in the truck. The next, I was somewhere else. The world around me was pure white, empty and endless. The truck was gone, the other soldiers gone. I was standing in nothingness. I turned frantically, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Reynolds, no answer. Hello, a voice whispered back. Hello. I whipped around. A man stood in front of me. At least, I think it was a man. His face was wrong. No sé, no lips. Just smooth, featureless skin, except for 2 deep black eyes, so dark they looked bottomless. He tilted his head. watching me. Then he smiled, not with his mouth, with his eyes, and I finally understood. This thing wasn't in the fog. The fog was inside it. The offer. The thing stepped forward, its body shifting with every movement, like it wasn't fully bound to one shape. It extended a hand toward me. A voice, my own voice, whispered inside my skull. Take my hand. I clenched my fists. I'm not playing this game. The thing tilted its head further, as if amused. Then it spoke again. You already played. The world shifted violently, and suddenly I was back in the truck. The door slammed shut behind me. I gasped, heart hammering, my skin damp with sweat. The other soldiers were there. Reynolds was there, but something was different. The truck was moving again, but the highway outside was gone. Instead, we were driving through the fog. No city, no lights, just white nothingness stretching endlessly in every direction. And then the last radio message came through. A new voice this time. Calm, cold, final. Welcome back. And just like that, I remembered. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. We had never escaped. We had always belonged to it. The truck wasn't moving anymore. I didn't remember it stopping. 1 second, we were speeding through the fog. The next, dead silence. No engine, no tires on pavement. Just the distant hum of something too deep to be the wind. I swallowed, gripping my rifle. My hand was slick with sweat. Around me, the other soldiers sat in rigid silence, staring at nothing. The fog pressed against the windows, thick as smoke, curling and shifting like something was inside it, just waiting for us to step out. And then the radio clicked on. A voice, calm, steady, disturbingly human, cut through the silence. Do not be afraid. I felt my body lock up, not out of fear, out of recognition. I had heard this before. I had heard all of this before. Something is talking to us. The other soldiers turned their heads toward the radio, eyes glazed, entranced. Reynolds was still breathing heavy beside me, his fists clenched. He was the only one who looked like he was fighting it. The voice on the radio continued. You have been chosen. A crackle of static. Then a new voice, one I knew for certain had no business being on that frequency. My mother's voice. Danny? Sweetheart, is that you? Are you okay? I flinched so hard my rifle nearly slipped from my grip. I hadn't heard my mother's voice in years. She'd been dead since I was 14. I looked at Reynolds, my breath catching in my throat. His eyes were locked on the radio. I could see it in his expression. He was hearing someone too. A soldier near the front. Hale suddenly burst into tears, gripping the sides of his head. No, you're not real, he choked out. You're not. And his head snapped up, and his entire body went still, like a switch had flipped. His lips curled into a smile. I felt my pulse spike. Ale. His mouth moved, but his voice didn't come out. Instead, it came through the radio. I see it now. I shuddered. His head turned toward me too smoothly, his smile never fading. You should listen, Danny. I squeezed my eyes shut. Don't listen. Don't listen. Don't listen. Reynolds suddenly lunged forward, ripping the radio from the dashboard and slamming it against the metal floor. The plastic casing shattered. The broadcast cut out instantly. For a second, everything was silent again. Then the radio spoke one last time. No static, no distortion, just a voice so clear it could have been sitting right next to me. That was rude. Then the truck lurched violently, as if something outside had just slammed against it with inhuman force. The fog is inside the truck. The air changed. I can't explain it any other way. It was like the walls of the truck had shifted, stretching wider than they should have. The air smelled different, not like sweat, not like exhaust, like nothing at all. I turned my head, and someone else was sitting in the truck with us. I didn't see them arrive. They weren't there before, but now they were sitting calmly at the far end of the truck, hands resting neatly on their lap. A man in a suit, his face too smooth, his eyes too dark. He was smiling. The other soldiers hadn't noticed him yet. Reynolds did. I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes, the way his fingers twitched toward his sidearm. But before he could react, the man in the suit spoke. I am very happy to see you again. My stomach twisted. Again, I whispered. His grin widened. You don't remember? A hand gripped my wrist suddenly. I gasped, turning. It was Hale. His eyes were fully black now, his pupils lost in a sea of endless void. His smile matched the stranger's exactly. We've done this before, he whispered. The moment the words left his lips, something cold pressed against the back of my skull. Not a weapon, not a hand, a thought, a memory I didn't recognize. Me, standing in this truck before. Me, sitting in this exact seat, hearing this exact conversation. Me, never getting out. Reynolds snapped. He grabbed his sidearm and fired 3 shots into the man in the suit's chest. The bullets hit, but they didn't stop. They passed through him, like he was made of fog himself. Then his smile disappeared, not like a normal expression changing. It just blinked out of existence, like it had never been there in the first place. His voice dropped an octave. This is a waste of time. And just like that, the truck doors burst open, and the fog rushed in like a flood. The road that never ends. I felt us being pulled, not physically, something deeper, something pulling at our thoughts, at our memories. I turned to Reynolds, heart pounding. Run. He didn't hesitate. We bolted out of the truck, sprinting blindly into the fog. The other soldiers were gone, or maybe they had never existed in the first place. I didn't care anymore. I just ran. The ground felt wrong beneath my feet, like I was stepping on something that wasn't solid. And then I saw it, a road cutting through the fog, stretching endlessly into the distance. Reynolds saw it too, and we both froze. Because we knew that road. We had been driving on it for hours. We had been driving on it forever. It didn't lead anywhere. It never had. This wasn't a real place. This was something else entirely, and there was no way out. The fog thickened around us, pressing against my skin like something alive. The last thing I saw before it swallowed us completely was the man in the suit, standing exactly where we had been seconds ago, watching us disappear. His smile was back, and his voice, this time it was inside my head. Welcome home. Then everything went black. I woke up somewhere else. There was no truck, no folk, no Reynolds, just a vast, empty parking lot stretching endlessly in every direction. Rows of cars, hundreds of them, lined up neatly under flickering streetlights. I pushed myself up, my head pounding, my body aching like I'd been ripped apart and sewn back together. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I looked around, searching for any sign of life. Reynolds, my voice echoed, bouncing too many times like I was speaking inside a giant hollow space. Something shifted in the distance. A figure, not moving, just standing between 2 parked cars, watching me. A familiar shape, a man in a suit. No, not him. I took a shaky step forward. My boots didn't make a sound against the pavement. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. Then its head twitched, not like a normal movement, more like a skipping frame in a broken video. A voice drifted through the silence. You were out of place. It wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from inside my own head. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to breathe. Where am I? The figure took a step forward, then another, but it didn't get closer. I blinked. It was back where it started, like it had never moved at all. The voice returned, softer this time. You are remembering too much. I was never supposed to remember. I gripped my rifle, sweat dripping down my back. Where is Reynolds? Silence. Then a whisper, layered with 100 voices, overlapping into a single sentence. He's still running. I felt my stomach drop. I had to find him. I turned away from the figure and started moving, weaving through the endless rows of cars. My heart pounded against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to keep my eyes forward, don't look back. The parking lot stretched forever, but there was something wrong about the cars. They weren't real. They had no reflections. No dirt, no dents, no signs of ever being driven. Just empty, perfect shells arranged like props on a movie set. And the lights above me, they weren't casting shadows. The road to nowhere. After what felt like hours, I saw it. A road cutting through the parking lot, disappearing into the horizon. And at the very end of it, a figure running. Reynolds. I ran toward him, my boots finally making noise again, my breath ragged in my throat. Reynolds. He didn't stop. He didn't hear me. I pushed myself harder, closing the distance. That's when I saw what he was running from. Something massive loomed in the distance, shifting in and out of focus like a mirage. Not a single form, not a creature, more like a concept trying to take shape, failing, then trying again. It folded in on itself, splitting into dozens of writhing limbs, too many faces, all of them smiling. It wasn't chasing Reynolds. It was hurting him forward. Toward what? I didn't want to find out. A dead city. I finally reached him, grabbing his arm. "Reynolds, stop!" He whirled around, his eyes wide, wild with panic. He barely looked like himself anymore. Pale, sweat-soaked, shaking. His lips moved, but at first, nothing came out. Then, barely above a whisper, "I can't stop running." I stared at him. What? His breathing was uneven, his pupils too wide. "I don't know how long I've been running," he whispered. "I keep thinking I'll get out, but I don't. His voice broke. "I just wake up in another place." My chest tightened. I had woken up in another place too. Before I could respond, the ground lurched beneath us. The parking lot vanished, dissolving into dust. We were somewhere new, somewhere worse. It's spreading. We stood in the middle of a dead city. Collapsed buildings. Cars overturned in the streets. No sound. No movement. It was too familiar, like a place I had been before but forgotten. The air smelled wrong. Not like decay. Not like fire. Like a place that had been erased from existence. Reynolds let out a shaking breath. "It's spreading." I turned to him, my heart hammering. "What?" He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling. "I don't think we're in a real place anymore." He swallowed. "I think we're in the aftermath of something." A deep chill ran down my spine. The fog, the broadcasts, the people dissolving into nothing. It wasn't just an event. It was a process. Something was erasing reality itself, and we had slipped through the cracks. The last warning, the radio clipped to Reynolds' vest crackled to life. Both of us froze. No static this time, just a voice. Not distorted, not warped, perfectly clear. "Turn around." Every muscle in my body locked up. Reynolds' breathing hitched. "Don't," he whispered. I clenched my fists. I didn't want to, but I had to know. I turned around, and I saw everything. The city was shifting, warping like a film reel being rewound at inhuman speed. Buildings crumbling, rising again, twisting into new shapes, then collapsing once more. Shadows stretched along the pavement, but they didn't belong to anything human. And in the center of it all, the man in the suit, standing at the edge of reality, watching, waiting. His lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. The radio crackled one last time, and the final message came through. "You've seen too much." The world fractured around me, and then everything went black. I woke up screaming. My lungs burned, my throat raw, like I'd been shouting for hours. My pulse hammered against my skull, a deep, throbbing pain that made it hard to focus. I was lying on concrete. Cold, rough, real. For a split second, I thought, I'm back. I made it out. Then I opened my eyes. I was in a bunker. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering every few seconds. The walls were metal, lined with rusting equipment and outdated monitors, some still blinking with dim green text. A single door stood at the far end of the room, and Reynolds was sitting against the wall, his head in his hands. He looked worse than before. Paler, thinner, even like whatever we had been running from was pulling something out of him little by little. He didn't look up when I sat up. "Where are we?" I croaked. His fingers tightened against his scalp. "I don't know anymore. The last shelter." I forced myself to stand, my legs weak beneath me. The bunker felt real, but something was off. The air was too still, the walls too quiet. And then I noticed the papers scattered across the floor. Some were handwritten notes, others were printed reports from some kind of research team. I picked one up. The header read, Site 13 Incident Report, Final Transmission. My breath caught in my throat. I skimmed the page, my hands shaking. Mimetic anomaly detected within the blast radius. Exposure vector unknown. Symptoms include cognitive erosion, spatial displacement, and recursive temporal loops. Final containment measures failed. Remaining personnel advised to avoid perception. My head swam. Reynolds exhaled shakily. "This isn't a bunker." I turned to him. "What do you mean?" His eyes were hollow, rimmed with dark circles. He looked like he hadn't slept in years. "This is just another layer," he whispered. "Another version of the same place." I swallowed hard. "So we never left?" He shook his head. I felt something cold crawl on my spine. Then from somewhere deep inside the bunker, I heard it. A radio transmission crackling through unseen speakers. A distorted voice. No, multiple voices, whispering at once. "Stop running. It wants us to stay." I turned toward the door. "We need to keep moving." Reynolds let out a bitter laugh. "To where?" I hesitated. I didn't know, but I knew staying here was worse. I grabbed him by the arm, hauling him to his feet. "We're not dying in here." For a moment, I thought he would resist. Then he nodded. We approached the door together. I hesitated before gripping the handle. A deep sense of wrongness crawled through my skull. The door wasn't locked, but I knew if I opened it, the world beyond wouldn't be the same. It never was. I took a breath, and I opened it. The hallway that shouldn't exist. The hallway outside was too long. It stretched impossibly far, the walls pulsing faintly like they were breathing. Something about the perspective was wrong. The farther I looked, the more the walls seemed to curve inward, warping into impossible angles. A soft humming sound filled the space. Reynolds tensed beside me. "We're not alone," he whispered. I didn't respond, because I could feel it too. Something was in the hallway with us. I just couldn't see it yet. We moved slowly, our boots barely making a sound. My fingers tightened around my rifle, though I wasn't sure it would help. We passed a room with an open door, the fluorescent lights inside flickering. Something moved inside. I stopped. Reynolds grabbed my arm. "Don't," but I had already turned my head. The scientist who never left. A man sat at a desk, hunched over stacks of papers. His lab coat was yellowed, his skin gray, like he had been rotting for years. But he was still moving, still writing something over and over again in frantic, jerky strokes. I stepped closer. The paper was covered in the same 3 words, repeated endlessly. "Do not look." I exhaled sharply. "Sir," he didn't respond. I reached out, hesitating before placing a hand on his shoulder. The second my fingers touched the fabric, his head snapped up, his mouth stretched open, his jaw unhinging like a snake's. And in my voice, he shrieked, "Don't look, don't look, don't look, don't look." I staggered back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The lights burst, plunging the room into darkness. Reynolds grabbed me, yanking me back into the hallway. We ran. It's changing again. The hallway shifted as we moved. Doors appeared where there hadn't been any. Some flickered in and out of existence, like the bunker itself was unstable. Reynolds' breathing was ragged. "It's playing with us." I didn't respond, because I was realizing something else. The humming sound had gotten closer. It was singing now, not in a language I understood, but I felt the meaning deep in my bones. A lullaby, a welcome song. I looked over my shoulder and froze. The end of the hallway wasn't a hallway anymore. It was a window into somewhere else. A city stretching far beyond comprehension, built from fractured geometry and shifting structures that never stayed the same shape for more than a few seconds. Figures moved within it, watching us from the edges of reality itself. Waiting. Reynolds stopped beside me, his breathing ragged. "That's where we're going, isn't it?" I didn't answer, because I already knew. There was no escape. There never had been. The final message. The hallway collapsed around us, folding in like a crumpled sheet of paper. I barely had time to react before everything went black. The last thing I heard, the emergency broadcast system. One final transmission. Clear, calm, undeniable. "This is not a test. You are already there." And then silence. I didn't wake up this time, because I was never asleep. I was standing in a vast void, empty yet full, stretching beyond what my mind could comprehend. I could feel the weight of existence pressing against me, an overwhelming sense of awareness, like I had been peeled open and left exposed to something that should not be watching. Reynolds was beside me, barely breathing. His eyes were too wide, his skin too pale. And beyond him, the city was waiting. The place beyond the fog, the fractured skyline, the twisting geometry of something that wasn't built by human hands. I couldn't tell if the city was new or if it had always been there, just out of sight, just beyond the edges of what we were allowed to perceive. But now we could see it, and that meant it could see us too. A deep, thrumming sound vibrated through my bones, rising from the city like a pulse. A rhythm, a heartbeat. Reynolds let out a ragged breath. "We're not supposed to be here." His voice sounded too small against the sheer enormity of whatever was ahead of us. I swallowed. "No, we're not." Then, in the distance, something moved. The things that live in the fog. At first, it looked like shadows stretching unnaturally across the broken cityscape. Then the shadows stood up. Tall, thin figures, their bodies shifting like they were half-formed, flickering in and out of focus. Some had too many limbs, others had no faces at all, just smooth expanses of skin where their features should have been. They didn't walk, they glided, moving in unnatural, jerky patterns, like they weren't fully bound by the laws of physics, and they were coming toward us. Reynolds gripped my wrist, his fingers ice cold. "We need to run." I didn't argue. We turned and bolted, sprinting across the endless void, the city shrinking behind us. But no matter how far we ran, the space never changed. There was no horizon, no landmarks, just nothing. And then, as if reality itself was mocking us, I saw something ahead. A single, unmarked door standing alone in the emptiness. The door that shouldn't exist. Reynolds stopped first, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "What the hell?" I didn't have an answer. The door was metal, rusted at the edges, a single red warning sticker peeling away from its surface. Something about it felt wrong, like it had been left here for us. The figures in the distance were getting closer. The air was thick with something unseen, pressing down on us like invisible hands, whispering just beneath the threshold of understanding. Reynolds hesitated. Then, without another word, he grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. Inside the broadcast, we fell, not down, but in every direction at once. The world folded inside itself, and suddenly we were somewhere else. We landed hard on a concrete floor, the air thick with dust and the scent of burning wires. I pushed myself up, my head pounding. We were in a control room. Old, rusting monitors lined the walls, blinking with static and distorted images. Dials and levers covered a central console, everything coated in a thick layer of dust. And in the center of the room, a single radio transmitter crackling with an unseen signal. I exhaled sharply. What the hell is this place? Reynolds was already moving, his hands skimming the equipment. His fingers trembled as he lifted a yellow document from the console. His eyes scanned the page. Then his face drained of color. "It's the emergency alert system." My pulse stuttered. "What?" He turned the paper toward me. The words were smudged and faded, but I could still make them out. Site 13, Contingency Protocol. Emergency Alert System. Automated broadcast. Transmission required to maintain containment. A slow, suffocating realization settled over me. The alerts, the warnings, they weren't just alerts. They were a barrier, a signal meant to keep something in, and now it was failing. The broadcast has to continue. Reynolds' hands shook as he turned back to the console. "If we stop the broadcast," he swallowed, "the containment breaks completely." I stared at him. Reynolds, he met my gaze. His eyes were already hollow, like he knew the answer before I even asked the question. "We already stopped it, didn't we?" A high-pitched whine filled the air. The monitors flickered violently, the static shifting into moving images. Not cameras, memories. Me and Reynolds inside the truck. Me and Reynolds in the bunker. Me and Reynolds standing exactly where we were now, reading these exact words, making this exact choice. A voice whispered through the static. "You've done this before." I staggered backward, my mind screaming in protest. The loop is closing. A deep thudding sound echoed through the walls. Footsteps. Something was coming. The figures from the city, the things from the fog. And I finally understood. They weren't just chasing us. They were hurting us, guiding us back to the place where we always ended up. I turned to Reynolds. "There has to be a way to end this." His gaze flickered toward the transmitter, then back to me. And I knew what he was thinking. Destroy the signal. End the loop. Let the containment fully collapse. We had never done it before. We had always played our roles, running in circles, resetting the broadcast, keeping this cycle alive. If we stopped it, what would happen? Reynolds swallowed. Then he picked up his rifle. I took a deep breath. The footsteps were getting closer. We didn't have time to think, only time to decide. And as my fingers tightened around the transmitter, ready to make the choice that had never been made before, the radio crackled one last time. A voice, deep, calm, familiar. "This is your last chance." Then everything shattered. The radio signal collapsed. The control room shook, the walls warping, flickering in and out of existence. Reality itself was unraveling around us. The monitors, once displaying static, now showed nothing at all. A black void stretching endlessly. Reynolds and I stood over the transmitter, our fingers hovering over the controls. We had one choice left: restart the broadcast or destroy it for good. Footsteps echoed in the distance. Something was coming, something that had been waiting for us to fail. Reynolds clenched his jaw. If we do this, we can't take it back. I swallowed hard. If we don't, we keep repeating this. A deep hum filled the air. The bunker was compressing, folding in on itself like a dying star. I gritted my teeth and reached for the transmitter. And that's when the man in the suit spoke. The last warning. His voice wasn't coming from the radio this time. It was inside my own head. Calm, collected, certain. This is a mistake. I froze. The control room warped, the walls glitching, shifting between the bunker, the truck, the checkpoint, the city, as if reality couldn't decide where we were supposed to be. I turned, and he was standing in the doorway, untouched by the chaos around him. The man in the suit. His face was smooth, featureless except for those deep black eyes, staring at me like he had been here since the beginning. Maybe he had. Maybe he had been in every version of this place, watching us fail over and over again. I tightened my grip on the transmitter. His expression never changed. He only said one thing. You don't understand what's on the other side. What happens if we stop it? Reynolds exhaled sharply. That's the point. He raised his rifle and fired. 3 rounds slammed into the man's chest and passed straight through him. No blood, no reaction, like he wasn't really there at all. The lights flickered violently. The room shook harder, metal groaning as the entire structure started to collapse inward. Reynolds turned to me, his voice urgent. Now, Danny. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the transmitter and I ripped it from the console. The moment it disconnected, the broadcast died completely and the world split apart. The collapse. I felt everything break. The walls shattered, dissolving into endless fog. The ceiling peeled away, revealing nothing but blackness above us. And the ground beneath us was gone. We were falling. No wind, no gravity, just a slow, endless descent into nothingness. Reynolds reached for me. Our fingers brushed. Then we were ripped away from each other. I opened my mouth to scream, and then I woke up in the city. I was standing in the middle of the street. No bunker, no fog, just a quiet, deserted city. My rifle was gone. My gear was gone. Even my own shadow was missing. I turned in a slow circle, my heart hammering. No wind, no birds, just silence. Then I saw the billboard overhead. The same emergency message flashing in bold, red text. This is not a test. Evacuation order lifted. All clear. My blood ran cold. I looked around. The streets were empty. No bodies. No signs of an evacuation. No evidence that anyone had ever lived here at all. Reynolds is gone. I turned frantically, searching for him. Reynolds, no answer. Reynolds, nothing. I was alone. I took a shaky breath. Then I caught movement in the corner of my eye. A reflection in a store window. I turned, and my heart stopped. The reflection is wrong. My reflection was staring back at me, but it wasn't doing what I was doing. It stood there completely still, watching me with wide, empty eyes. Then slowly it smiled. A deep, stretching grin, too wide for my face. My stomach twisted. I raised my hand. The reflection didn't move. I took a slow step forward. It took a step backward. Then it spoke. Not with my voice. Not with any voice I had ever heard. Just a soft, distorted whisper. The final broadcast. I stumbled back, gasping. My pulse slammed against my ribs, panic rising like bile. The emergency sirens wailed in the distance, distant and broken, like a signal still trying to reach someone. But there was no one left to hear it. I was alone. Or maybe I was never supposed to leave. Maybe I had never been anywhere else at all. I swallowed, staring at my reflection. It was still smiling. It raised its hand, a single finger to its lips, a silent command. Do not speak of this. I turned away and I started walking, not toward the city, not toward escape, just forward, because there was nowhere else to go. The last emergency alert flashed across the dark, empty sky. One final message. This is not a test. The signal has been lost. Good luck. And as I disappeared into the silence, I finally understood. I had never escaped. I had just become part of the broadcast.